Everyone. Welcome to the second presentation in SHI's Alaska Native Subsistence Lecture Series. This lecture is entitled Herring and People of the North Pacific, Sustaining a Foundational and Keystone Species, which celebrates the publication of the book of that title by Dr. Thomas Thornton and Professor Madonna Moss. I am Chuck Smythe, Director of the Culture and History Department. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. After the lecture, we invite you to submit questions in the chat box in YouTube. Professors Thornton and Moss have graciously agreed to answer questions at the end of the presentation. We are happy to announce that Professor Madonna Moss will join us partway through the lecture and join and provide important information in her presentation. Thomas F. Thornton is Professor of Environment and Society and Director of the Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center at the University of Alaska Southeast. His research interests include indigenous and local knowledge systems and human environmental interactions, the political ecology of sustainable development and resource stewardship in complex social ecological systems, and human adaptation to environmental change in the North Pacific, especially Southeast Alaska. He is the author of The Distribution of Subsistence Herring Eggs from Sitka Sound, Alaska, published in 2019. Dr. Thornton.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I think this is my fourth lecture in the last 2 years. I think I'm risking overexposure, but two of them have been on the topic of herring, and it's obviously very important, and it's very important this time of year. So I appreciate that Sealaska is devoting some attention to it and emphasis on that topic. While I put up my screen here, let's see, is that going to work? And then, all right, so hopefully you're seeing that. You're seeing what I'm seeing. So yeah, the book is called Herring and People of the North Pacific, Sustaining a Keystone Species. And this is a kind of a book that was a long way in production. It actually started back in the, I would say, at University of Alaska Southeast in the 1990s when I had an elder who ended up adopting me as his brother, Herman Kitka Sr., co-teach a class on culture and ecology in Southeast Alaska. And one of the species, or one of the categories of species we focused on was non-salmon fish, as Fish and Game sometimes refers to it, and ended up doing quite a bit on herring. And it really piqued my awareness, which was not absent before that, but really about how important herring were, not just as a cultural resource, but as a natural resource and critical keystone, and as Chuck said, foundation species in the ecosystem. And so I began to work on it really in the early 2000s and produced a big study for the North Pacific Research Board, in which Madonna Moss was also involved, Virginia Butler, another archaeologist, and several graduate students, and myself. And then as the issue began to evolve, we thought about taking a broader perspective on the North Pacific and looking not only at Southeast, but primarily at Southeast, but also the meaning and importance of herring throughout the North Pacific. So I'll just position this book literally in a kaleidoscope, which is to say that there's a kind of an increase in fishing books and oceanic perspectives on history. And I think it's refreshing because living in this part of the world, I think we're dominated by terrestrial perspectives and agricultural perspectives. And that can lead to distortions about why we are where we are. economically, ecologically, and in other ways. So this kind of plethora of, they're sometimes called microhistories on species like cod and herring, or menhaden, shad. They can be quite illuminating and kind of a different lens on seeing history. And certainly that was one of our intentions with looking at herring. And to do a kind of quick history, if you look at the distribution of herring, you've got different species, and the major ones being the Pacific and the Atlantic varieties. And it's basically a northern hemisphere fish. But if you put the range of herring up there on both the Pacific and the Atlantic, you get very much this oceanic perspective that I'm talking about. And if you combine that with maybe an understanding of how much diversity, how much productivity, and even how much conflict, which is certainly a subject of this book, you have, a lot of it actually does come down to competition over that productivity. And the foundation of that productivity in the Northern Hemisphere, both Atlantic and Pacific, is very much dependent on herring, and not just some herring, but a lot of herring. And in the Pacific, it's often characterized as a superabundance, at least historically. And so I'm quoting here in this slide the French naturalist La Cepede, who said, "If we may believe, the distribution of the herring tribe is one of the natural causes which decide the destiny of empires. Let us look then to our herrings." Now he's writing from Western Europe, and Cornhill magazine is writing from the UK perspective. But it's just to tell you that herring are important everywhere. And I'm not pretending that this book is something like Guns, Germs, and Steel, which, if many of you have read that, is really a book that attempts to explain why the old world conquered the new world, if you will. And the answer, of course, is guns, germs, and steel, but the answer is really geography, and the agricultural geography of the old world being more conducive to the spread of agriculture, the temperate zones in Eurasia, than they were in North America. But that's an answer that leaves out oceans altogether. So I don't think we should be satisfied with such explanations. In fact, I think many in this audience will know that the very colonization of the New World, if we look at that Pacific map on the top, we now believe followed this coastal migration even before the retreat of the ice sheets on the mainland. And if that's the case, well, then guns, germs, and steel is really not an adequate answer for how and why the New World was settled. So that's enough for the big picture. Now, if we take the story down to the Southeast regional level, which is really the major focus of this book, it's really a story about moving from superabundance to what you might characterize as a sub-minimum, not enough herring to support either commercial or subsistence livelihoods in Southeast Alaska. And the term that's used to describe that is really a shifted baseline. So we're dealing with a shifted baseline from what you had prior to contact, European contact in Southeast Alaska, to what you have now. And so that's the story. But to reduce it even further, if you look at the commercial fisheries area map of Southeast Alaska, basically you've got a bunch of different management zones there and that are outlined, and you can see that they're all closed except for Sitka Sound, which is the Sacro fishery, and Craig Cloac, which is the spawn on kelp fishery. So we do risk managing herring kind of out of existence if we're not careful. The graph on the bottom shows the history of harvest, particularly during the reduction era. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but that was when there were reduction plants all over Southeast Alaska, particularly up and down Chatham Strait, that turned herring into oil and feed and fertilizer for the agricultural industry. And then the issue of conflict, as I said, is a real one, because one of the chapters in the book talks about, as a subsection, the herring wars of the 21st century. And basically, we're seeing conflict emerge between commercial fisheries and subsistence fisheries, and between primarily non-indigenous managers and institutions managing herring for maximum sustained yield, and indigenous groups that have an interest, both commercial but primarily subsistence, in herring fisheries, protesting against this management as managing herring not conservatively enough, not according to precautionary principles, or even basic rules of respect. And so that's actually led to incidences of not of war, literal war, but of efforts to blockade and occupy the DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, in Canada and British Columbia, because of concerns about management for herring. And of course, here in Southeast Alaska, we have the lawsuit that was pursued by the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and in which they were victorious in several judgments against the state for not managing for subsistence. So a part of that story is in the book, but particularly the historical part, but it's still unfolding, of course, in both British Columbia and Alaska. And then, as I said, we broadened the perspective to include other areas of the North Pacific. And of course, the major area is the Sakhalin, Hokkaido region of what's now Russia and Japan, and the industrial development of that area, which occurred very contemporaneously, but maybe beginning a little bit before the reduction industry developed in Southeast Alaska. And you have major issues there. You have the competition for herring between commercial and subsistence fishers, but you also have the problem of contamination over there, which has been significant, including this massive die-off from June of 2018, and a similar one in 2005 in a place called Piltun Bay, actually triggered indigenous protests in Russia, which gained a lot of attention among conservation groups and internationally. And it was over this big die-off that occurred, and the indigenous people blamed the offshore oil drilling that was going on, and that was never conclusively proven, because it is hard to prove, but there was certainly evidence that was a contributing factor. And so they are also organizing. And I'll say a little bit more about Japan as well, but there's been some effort there to restore herring. So that's sort of the North Pacific view, coming into the global view. And then if you want to focus on a single community for the community level story, it would be Sitka. Certainly in the book, we cover a range of communities throughout Southeast, but Sitka being kind of at the forefront. And their story in a nutshell is told in this short quote by Herman Kitka, which is very much what he said in that class in 1996. Before the commercial herring sac-roe fishery, the Sitka Tlingit engaged in herring fishing from small boats. The herring caught, either raked or netted, were used to make herring oil. Herring eggs were taken and dried in the trees among the islands around Sitka. All of the islands have names and were used together with all the other families in the Sitka area. Herring fishing and egg gathering was the last week of March and the first 2 weeks of April, mostly under Uncle's direction for each family group. And some other comments that Herman Kitka Sr. made were that today, and that was even in the late 1990s, the duration of the spawning had become shorter. The spawning range, the extensity of spawn had shrunk. The customary and traditional use areas had become less reliable, and the quality and quantity of spawn had both declined. and the actual spawners themselves were getting smaller, meaning suggesting they were less mature. And rather than the 3 and 4 weeks of spawning, you were basically down in some cases to 3 days or even less of actual spawning, which made it harder for people to time their harvest, especially those coming from out of town, which is a tradition in Sitka, and for even the Sitkans to meet their subsistence needs. So that became the basis of really decades of struggle with the department and with the Board of Fish, and ultimately in the court system to determine what is the management responsibility to provide for reasonable opportunities for subsistence uses. And so the book is really about why this happened and what can be done. So there are actually 6 chapters in the book. The first is laying out this idea of herring as a foundation, keystone, and a bellwether species, an indicator of ecosystem health, if you will. Second chapter about life cycle and ecology, which I'm not going to say a lot about directly. The third chapter is herring in the archaeological record, which Madonna Moss will speak to, and she will be joining us later, hopefully. And then the fourth chapter, herring cultivation among the Tlingit and Haida, and that's a very deliberate use of the word cultivation against this farming tradition. Oops, sorry, going backwards. And then a fifth chapter on reframing sustainability in marine ecosystems in Southeast Alaska, and then 6, the requiem or revitalization of herring with a question mark. So why herring? If you want to understand ecosystems, cultures, whether you're a social scientist or scientist, it's hard to look at everything, right? We always use proxies, we always use lenses. And as far as lenses go, herring is a pretty important one because it is a foundation species from a biological standpoint, meaning it provides the foundation for the food system for a number of trophic levels above it and actually even below it. And it does this incredible job of converting the energy of particularly small critters, plankton, zooplankton, into a very oily, nutrient-rich package that comes in great numbers, superabundance, which is eaten by nearly every trophic level above it, and every trophic level above it, but by many species within those trophic levels. And so we're talking not just about salmon and halibut, other cultural keystone species, but seabirds, sea mammals, and of course, humans. And you can see here in the slide, this is a sea lion swimming through a school of herring, which is kind of an amazing piece of symmetry right there. But also you can see the abundance and probably a smile on that sea lion's face. So a little bit on history now. I'm not going to dwell on this, but putting the North Pacific together, you can focus on Alaska, British Columbia, and then on Japan, and understanding that Japan controlled kind of the major herring parts of what's now Russia at the critical time when it industrialized. And I've highlighted a couple of things, and one is that certainly in Alaska and British Columbia, the development of the industry doesn't come particularly early, but it is late 19th century. It's already in Southeast Alaska, but only one commercial herring production plant, which was at Killisnoo. And then you don't see the next one until about World War I, around 1917. And then, as I said, you got up to more than a dozen plants running more or less continuously up until the 40s, and then they began to close some of them, and the last one was closed in 1965. But really, the tragedy of the commons starts with bait fisheries, in that bait became an attractive commodity, and boats would cruise around Southeast Alaska and find massing herring and converge on them to produce bait for other fisheries. And actually they began to have a significant impact on herring stocks, and there were protests from indigenous groups as early as the early 1900s on the way herring were fished. And they didn't put this label on it because it wasn't really used until 1968 in Garrett Hardin's famous article. But what they were protesting was a tragedy of the commons, that there was essentially no regulation over these boats, and they just kept coming into where herring were massing. And that was not, that was undermining the role of herring, not only as a cultural resource for Tlinkits and Haidas, but also as a foundation for the ecosystem. And so there are good records of that, and some of those are discussed in the book. And you really have no regulation of the fishery, so people could fish where they wanted, or even record keeping until the early 20th century. And then by 1929, you've got a peak production of 80,000 tons, which has never been equaled. And then you see the beginning of a collapse in the herring fisheries occur. And so this is kind of often referred to as a tragedy, not just of the commons, but of commodification, because they kept producing a commodity that was in demand, despite the fact that it was becoming unsustainable. But regulations did begin to be put on after the collapse of the herring fishery, which is not the best time to regulate, by the way. And the declines continued through the 50s. Arguably, they had an impact on the salmon collapse in the 1950s as well, although fish traps and overfishing had a lot to do with that as well. Sorry, in the wrong button there. Okay, so anyway, so then in the 1960s, Alaska begins to manage its own fisheries. And certainly the tragedy of the commons continues, but less so in the nearshore areas. But at that time, you didn't have what we have today through the Magnuson-Stevens Act of a exclusive economic zone of 200 miles. And so, so Japanese boats and Russian boats were actually, having overfished their stocks, were actually fishing herring very close to the Alaskan coast right up until that time. And so the Magnuson-Stevens Act cut that off, and then you see the beginning of the Sacro and other fisheries, which then import the products that they would have produced from herring from British Columbia and Alaska. And then on the right side, you can see sort of the same timeline and set of circumstances developing in Japan. And I highlighted the high point there, which comes, at least from the historical records, in 1879. And there's a herring harvest of almost 1 million tons. And you know, that's considerably larger than the 80,000 tons, but it's a larger area. But still, incredible productivity there. And by the mid-century, just as in the Alaska side, you've got a complete collapse of both Western and Eastern Hokkaido, the very productive areas in Japan. And that's when the importation begins. And of course, Japan's economic status rises considerably beginning in the 1980s. And so they can afford to pay good money for luxury goods like Kazunoko, which is the what we call sacro, the roe and the skein that is a luxury product. So that's a bit of history, and I'm not doing the Russian part justice, but there's more on that in the book. And you might say that the history of herring has really been an undervaluing of herring as a foundation and cultural keystone species. But when we did the traditional knowledge study, interviewing over several studies, more than 100 people throughout Southeast Alaska, most of them native, but not all, some of them other local knowledge bearers, we got a different set of values that applied to herring, and a strong recognition, as indicated by Harold Martin's statement here, of how important herring are as a foundation for the ecosystems and as the feed for everything, as he put it, and the feed for everything that we depend on. And so not just a cultural keystone species, but a keystone species for the whole socio-ecological system. And the graph there just shows you how high the percentages are on some of these key species in terms of herring as a percentage of the total diet. So what do I mean by cultural keystone species? This is a term that was developed in the anthropological literature by Garibaldi and Turner, but shorthand, it means very important over a long period of time, and not typically just to a single community, but to a region and even other regions through trade, and well developed in terms of its respect within art, within oral history, and so forth. Okay. So the other side of the story that this book tries to bring out is this idea of the cultivation complex. And this is the focus of one whole chapter. And this is the idea that herring weren't just harvested conservatively, but actually cultivated. And there's sort of 5 aspects to this, at least. And in the book, I sort of tried to divide it up into demand strategies and supply strategies, that is for maintaining or increasing supply of herring eggs, partly to appeal to the ecological economists who might be reading. But when we talk about cultivation here, we're saying that you're actually treating herring as an agent that has a choice about whether it comes to spawn in a particular area and how and when it comes to spawn. And so when you see herring that way, and even in the traditional notion as having not only agency, but a kind of non-human personhood, you have to treat herring respectfully. And so the initiation protocols, I'm talking about ways of inviting herring in and attracting herring to the areas where you want them to spawn. And there are a number of practices from the way people put branches, from the things they said to herring, the songs they sung to herring, and a whole variety of ways that they tried to make the area attractive. But perhaps the most important was quieting the area so that there was not too much noise. And this was done particularly in areas where there were small bays and so forth, where herring would want to be not disturbed, so they would settle down and spawn. A second strategy was habitat protection, so limiting not just noise in spawning areas, but number of people setting in those areas, and other activities. And then the idea of cultivation also is you're literally putting branches down. The western hemlock branches being the main substrate, and doing it in such a way that you're actually increasing the area that is attractive for herring to come and spawn on, and therefore increasing the habitat, if you will, for spawning. And then that's complemented by selective harvest practices, including the return of eggs to the water, for example, that were laid on branches that the egg deposition was too thin. So it's too thin to be a good cultural food product, but by returning it to the ocean or leaving it in place, it provides a means of reproduction. In fact, thicker eggs may be less likely to have successful reproduction because not all of them get fertilized typically. So a number of different prescriptions on how to harvest so that you're not taking everything. You're actually leaving a lot of herring eggs in the water, but giving them a stable place to hatch out. And then fifth, you had the transplantation of eggs. So we argue in the book that the historical ecology suggests that the coevolution of people and herring in places like Sitka Sound was such that the cultivation activities enhanced habitat and egg production, more than likely offsetting any harvest impacts that subsistence egg gathering might have had. So that's a pretty strong claim. Okay, and then this is a little bit about the original harvest area. And if you know the regulatory history of Sitka Sound, you'll see that the core area for subsistence has been recognized, but in a very circumscribed fashion by that purple um, polygon in the middle there. And the arrows are essentially pointing to typically how herring come in, where they lay before they spawn, and then how the spawning begins. And traditionally that was at Herring Rock, which is this sacred site for the Kiksati clan, and blanket on the left represents that. And it's commemorated also at the tribal community house in Sitka, and then spread out from there. But the whole area that's marked by orange was essentially under cultivation. And I have a long-term interest in place names, so I mark the place names here with Herman Kitka, and also the migration patterns that we picked up through the traditional knowledge, and also with Harvey Kitka, who is my co-author on this. So there's a lot going on there, but that's part of this complex. And then, of course, when I gave a lecture last year on herring, I was talking about the distribution system, which was through a study that was actually funded by Sealaska Heritage Institute to look at the benefits and distribution of herring eggs. And so part of this economy is that it has tremendous benefit flows. So even though the 150,000 to 250,000 pounds of herring is what's harvested in the contemporary era, surveys tell us at least, that product, 87% of it is being distributed on average, either through sharing or barter or trade. And by those means, it's reaching perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 recipients through primary and secondary distribution, consumption at kuiks, parties, cultural events, and so forth, in nearly 50 communities in greater Southeast Alaska. And so these are benefits that are produced. Food security, especially because it's one of the first fish of the season. It's a healthy fish, high in omega-3s, other nutrients. In fact, a competing fishery is really capturing herring for production of supplements with omega-3s and so on. For heritage and cultural identity, for ceremonies, as I said, and really just the communion and social capital that comes with sharing the first fruits of the season. And also, of course, there are a lot of cultural skills that go along with the laying of branches, the collection of herring eggs, the processing, and the distribution. And so I don't have time to read all these quotes, but there's a lovely quote there from Vivian Mork, who also spoke in another forum about herring eggs and their importance. And then finally, I wanted to mention some of the things that are happening today. So I think there's a positive story here, in that there's a kind of been a strong awakening particularly amongst Indigenous people, about how herring is being undervalued by the main economy, if you will. I don't want to say the economy, but the main economy, and protesting this, but also trying to develop an alternative narrative and understanding of herring that's based on more traditional cultural values, where you're honoring herring as a non-human persons, and recognizing the covenant that exists with these herring spawning activities, and with one's responsibilities to herring when one gathers and lays branches and collects eggs and so forth. And that's a very promising development, because I think within the bureaucratic management system, that voice was heavily marginalized, both because at a Board of Fish meeting, you're limited in the amount of time you can speak. But if how you speak is not backed by quote unquote data as defined by science, then it's typically just dismissed as anecdotal or something that's cultural and not scientific. And that's been very unfortunate. But by creating a kind of separate forum, a ceremonial forum, to celebrate and talk about the values of herring, I think that paradigm is beginning to shift, or hopefully. So I will end that part, my part of the presentation there, and I'll say my thank yous here, but if perhaps I'll go over it if we have time at the end. But I don't know, Chuck, if Madonna Moss is on yet, but I want to make sure she has some time to talk about the archaeology.
She is there. Here she comes.
Okay, should I stop sharing so she can do that?
Yes, yeah, that'd be good.
Hello, Tom.
Hi there. So are you on
Hi,
now?
Chuck.
I think you're
I'm
on.
Thank you. Thank you. Tom, that was great. You really gave a wonderfully comprehensive, amazingly comprehensive overview of the book. And certainly working with you on this book has been a long-term process, but I have to say, one of the highlights of my career. I have just a few slides to share. And I'm not going to try to replicate what's in the book, but I want to give you a short version of kind of where I started, go through the middle, and then talk some about our future research on herring, our ongoing research with herring. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hoping for the best here.
Looks good.
Oh, good. Great. Always good to know. So I first learned about herring, I think, working on this project with Dick Newton, which was originally called the Subsistence Lifeway of the Tlingit people, but was reissued by the Forest Service a couple of times. And I think the most recent title is here. I really had some wonderful experiences working for the Forest Service. I got to work with Gabriel George. I got to work with Richard Newton, as well as Matthew Fred and dozens of other people. And I know that Dick Newton is a special person to Tom as well, because as I remember, Tom, I think you took language lessons from Dick way back in the 1980s. Is that right? Am I remembering this correctly?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that I learned in this process that certainly interested me, piqued my interest in herring. And these go back to the 1970s. But I remember we interviewed George Davis, and he talked about how people came all the way from Hoona and Sitka to set up camp and fish for herring in Mitchell Bay and Favorite Bay. And these would be on Admiralty Island. And so he remembered when people still traveled to the Angoon area to get herring. And of course, they don't do that today, to my knowledge. The mash left over from processing the oil was used to fertilize gardens. And then I also remember wonderful, and I'm going to quote from Mr. Henry Katass, who also contributed to this, this booklet that we put together. He talked about how when we were small kids, when the family moved to Union Bay, I distinctly remember raking herrings into a canoe until it was loaded down. They were rendered down over an open fire with everyone working. We kids were running around the canoe with herring in it. Late in the afternoon, we were each given a cracker, pilot bread, as some people call it, and we put some herring on it. After it was rendered down, it was so crisp and tasty. After all, we had been playing all day. we had great big pot of herring mash. It was hot and good tasting, all you could eat. Later in the fall, they did trade herring oil for smiling berries. So I do remember that quote so clearly because I remember it just sounded so delicious to talk about the herring mash as crispy and tasty. And of course, when you're outside in March, no, in this case, it would have been in the fall probably because they were processing the herring into oil. It could be cold, it could be dark, it could be rainy, but to have such a wonderful food is something that occurred within living memory of people that we've had the privilege to work with. And of course, nowadays, you don't have people raking herring into canoes, and you don't have people making herring oil out in that way, in the same way. So certainly these were, this was some of the initial things that I learned about herring. When I worked on my dissertation back in the 1980s, I worked on a number of sites on the southwest corner of Admiralty Island. Sorry, I don't have a context map for us here, but here's Angoon, and you can see Mitchell Bay and Favorite Bay were both known places where there were herring. And one of the sites I worked at on the east side of the peninsula here, 99% of the fish in that site were herring bones, which was just incredible. And so that also piqued my interest in this fish. You had to use very small screens, 2mm mesh, to be able to capture them from an archaeological deposit. And we only had a small deposit or small samples from this site, but it was very interesting. And of course, this was a place that was important for herring. And we know that from a lot of different sources, but I just mentioned that in 1882, when the US Navy bombed Angoon, people were up inside Favorite Bay processing herring for their oil. So the eggs, the meat, the flesh, they were smoked, but the oil was also super important. And these were important lessons to learn early. So I think it was 2005, maybe it was 2006, Tom invited Virginia Butler at Portland State University and me at the University of Oregon to work with him on this herring synthesis process. And so we put together data on all the archaeological sites that had been tested or test excavated or had some level of excavation, some investigation in Southeast Alaska. And we put together this information, and we found that when archaeologists use the correct recovery techniques, that is, when they used fine mesh screens that are going to catch these bones, that 75% of the sites in Southeast Alaska yielded herring bones. So these vertebra is the most common remain we find. We find some of the head bones too, but it's the vertebra that are most abundant, and but you need these fine mesh screens to capture them. These are some of the named sites where we have herringbone samples. And you can see they occur on the outer islands, on the inner islands, and on the mainland. So it's a pretty broad, widespread distribution, indicating abundant herring across Southeast Alaska, not just in a single place like Sitka. Herring in the archaeological record, again, require the recovery through these fine mesh screens. In compiling information for beyond Southeast Alaska, I worked with my colleague Ian McKechnie, who's at the University of Victoria, south end of Vancouver Island here. And we put together this database of over 500,000 bones, fish bones from archaeological sites across the North Pacific, across the Northwest coast, really, from Alaska down into the Salish Sea region of Western Washington. And it was interesting to see that in Southeast Alaska, herring as a percentage of fish found in archaeological sites range from maybe 5% to about 40%. So quite a wide range in terms of abundance. In northern BC, And Haida Gwaii, it was similar. Central BC, a higher percentage, but then in Western Vancouver Island and Salish Sea, it was interesting to see that at least as measured by number of identified specimens, the herring were super abundant in this area here of the east coast of Vancouver Island, the Salish Sea into Puget Sound, and then also the west coast of Vancouver Island. And here's Ian here, Ian McKechnie. And you can see by this chart, I hope, that herring are up at the top. They are the most ubiquitous fish found in 96% of the assemblages across this large region. So they were super common. In fact, they were as common as salmon bones in these archaeological sites. Even though the region is very well known for the importance of salmon, it's less so for the importance of herring, but herring are truly ubiquitous across the northwest coast. Some of these other fishes I'll just mention incidentally, some species of cod, some small cods, anchovies, smelts. Some of these fish as well have very small bones and have to be recovered with these fine mesh screens, but it's sometimes pretty tricky to identify these little fish bones. I have to use a microscope to do it. So in terms of their coastwide survey of genetic population structure, this is something I've been working with Eleni Petru and Lawrence Hauser at the University of Washington, who are both molecular ecologists in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Science. And this was a topic of Eleni's dissertation, looking at the herring in the Puget Sound, Salish Sea region. But she's broadened out with her former advisor, Lorenz Hauser, and what they're trying to do is they're studying the modern genetics, the modern DNA of, or the DNA of modern herring, to see what genetic markers distinguish the herring in different parts of the coast. And the most telling markers genetically appear to relate to spawn timing. And so that's why we have the different colors here. So you can see that even in Alaska, we have different spawn times represented. And Eleni and co-authors, we just published this paper just last month in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B on the functional genetic diversity of herring. And we're in the process now of broadening this out and getting many more samples from Southeast Alaska. So we've got 300 samples of modern herring that have been sequenced, and Eleni is doing the statistical work now to analyze those genes to better understand the genetic structure of the modern herring, which we want to compare to the genetic structure of the ancient herring. That is something that I've published on, but we realize we need more detail from the modern herring to make these comparisons. So we've kind of been on hold with regard to the ancient herring. But with Eleni and other researchers, Danya Yang at Simon Fraser University, Camilla Speller at University of British Columbia, we're going to be revisiting the ancient herring, the archaeological specimens of herring from these sites that range in age. Some of them are quite old, in this case, going back over 2,000 years old. Looking at these samples and trying to find the same genetic markers on the ancient herring by targeting specific genes that Eleni and Lawrence know relate to spawn timing. And so we don't know that we can do it, but we hope to actually do genomic work, looking at the entire genome, trying to reconstruct the entire genome from some of these samples. And initially, we're going to look at Jamestown Bay, which is in Sitka, and it's privately owned, but I had samples from it from over 30 years ago that we're using. And then the Krestoff shell midden is on Kruzof Island, not far from Sitka. And here's Jonathan Feldpatch and I, having found the site in 2011, I believe. And then the other site we're going to look at is a material from Craig, Alaska, which is actually on the Forest Service compound there, but there was archaeological work done, and we have a nice sample of herring bones from there. So the idea is to compare the ancient to the modern and better understand how genetic diversity has changed over time. So those are the few slides I put together. I'd be happy to answer any questions or whatever works for people.
Well, thank you very much, both Professor Madonna Moss and Tom Thornton, for a fabulous presentation with lots of information and lots of interest in the book. Before we go to questions, were you going to make an announcement about the book, the availability of the book to those attending the lecture today?
I can do that. Are you talking about discounts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pass on the wealth.
I have the code, but this is actually courtesy of University of Washington Press. They are extending a 30% discount if you use the following code and order through their website, which is University of Washington Press. So I don't think it works at Sealaska Heritage Institute bookstore, but I don't know, maybe. But it's W like Washington 193. So there's a place when you order, there's a discount code. So if you put in that space, W193, I'm told you'll get a 30% discount on the book.
But for those of you in town and who can't wait, please come down to SHI store and knock on the door and let them know you're interested in the book, because it's a fabulous book, and a lot of us have already looked at it, and it's just a really good presentation of both the historical and the contemporary issues. We do have quite a few questions. Perhaps I'll start with an archaeological question first, which is, what is the earliest period when herring were present in Southeast Alaska?
I'm so sorry I didn't mention that. Use of herring goes back 10,000 years from a site on Prince of Wales Island. So people were fishing for herring very early on, and continuing throughout the Holocene period. But by about 2,500 years ago, herring is just ubiquitous in sites. And it is pretty striking to look at the distribution of sites across the region and see how common they are, because that doesn't appear to be the case today. So yeah, the use of herring goes back 10,000 years. There's evidence on Haida Gwaii as well for ancient herring use going back to that age also.
Okay. Can I just say that I think one of the issues about herring that the archaeology maybe can speak to is whether or not it undergoes wild fluctuations, because we hear this from biologists that forage fish like herring, are boom and bust. They go through these cycles, but certainly in the oral history, there's not a lot of evidence that there were busts of herring. In fact, when you had seasons like the two winters, as it's sometimes referred to, herring were even more important as a staple because of other impacts on salmon and so forth. And so I'm wondering if that's partly a modern production of fishing and other patterns. But the impression we got from the oral history and the traditional knowledge was that if herring fluctuated, it was between a superabundance and a hell of a lot, not between
right.
A lot and very few. So what people now consider as normal, and this is the whole shifted baseline idea, with the amount of herring is one issue we tackle in the book, but another issue is this degree of fluctuation versus just having a kind of permanent superabundance. And I don't think we could resolve it, but it at least raises the question, is that really just a modern phenomenon, this boom and bust cycle, because we're fishing right on the margins, and herring aren't always recovering the way we think they should.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. In our study of the coastwide fisheries, we did not see any evidence for those kinds of fluctuations in herring. Now, the issue then becomes, are our data in terms of temporal analyses specific enough? And they're not. Most radiocarbon dates have quite a large standard deviation. And so we can't look at year to year or decade to decade. We're looking at several decades at a time generally. So we might not be picking up fluctuations, but at the moment, there does not appear to be evidence for any fluctuations in herring use. As you say, Tom, they were temporally abundant as well. And I like your, they were hell of a, what did you say? A hell of a lot abundant, or they were super abundant. So that's good.
So another question has to do with contemporary subsistence harvesting, and it is, do hemlock branches need to be refreshed each year?
Refreshed, meaning new branches are cut, new trees are cut. Yes. If I'm understanding that.
I think that's what he's getting at.
Yeah.
In other words, you don't use the same branches again. You don't cut new ones.
No, because you collect the herring eggs on those branches and they go in your freezer.
Yeah. So I think that
when you strip them off, it would be very hard to use the same branches. Plus the needles would drop off, I think. So I'm not aware of that happening.
So going back now, folks have been saying that in the herring populations, that herring is decreasing in size. When did herring begin to decrease in size, and what is causing the reduction in size?
Well, I don't have a robust regional picture on this, but from some of the statements made even by Herman Kitka that I referenced, it was attributed that the smaller herring were developing after the commercial sacro fishery was developed. And one of the things that the sacro fishery does is it targets mature herring, right, of a certain size and certain maturity, roe content, and that is the high priced product. So when you're targeting that, you have the possibility of taking older fish out of the age structure of the population and having more younger fish. And when fish are stressed, you can also see reproduction begin to happen earlier as a kind of survival mechanism. So they will start spawning earlier. And when they're spawning earlier in their maturation, their years of life, then they would tend to be smaller. So I think that's the analysis, that a stressed population will begin to become smaller when they at the age of reproduction. And if you're taking a larger segment of those older fish out, on average, you're going to see smaller spawning fish. So I think that's been shown with some scientific studies. And then, every year now Fish and Game measures or estimates the age structure of the population through sampling. And so this year, I know they're expecting a lot of 5-year-olds, which are can be pretty large herring, but very few 4-year-olds. And I don't remember how many 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, but I think the bulk of the population is getting younger and therefore smaller. And that presents other problems, because one of the traditional ecological knowledge about herring is that older fish are quite important in leading younger fish to their spawning areas. And if you're taking those fish out of the population before they spawn, younger fish may tend to congregate more closely together, and you would see a decrease in your overall number of spawning areas. And that certainly appears to be happening. So herring are spawning in a lot fewer areas than they did historically. And now, as I showed in the map, all of the commercial management areas are closed except for Sitka Sound and Craig Clawach, because there aren't enough herring there and not enough herring spawning, obviously, to support a commercial harvest. There are some herring there in most places, but they're not enough. So that's a concern with having smaller fish and less mature fish.
We have some more good questions. Here's one. Is pollution in the ocean or environment currently a big issue for herring?
I think it is. I mean, that image in Thornton Bay, is attributed by most observers as a result of pollution, oil pollution from drilling, major die-off. They've had several. But you also have diseases that can come through pollution. You have habitat loss that can come from water quality declining or from development along the coast. And certainly, in Juneau, we talk about shifted baselines. So some people from Juneau may not realize that we used to have the second largest herring spawn in northern Southeast was right there in Auk Bay and Indian Point. And that area, particularly Indian Cove, was developed. And that certainly had an impact on the water quality and probably the health of that spawning area. And then, of course, on the Auk Bay side, you have one of the largest boat harbors in the region. And that's not necessarily conducive to herring spawn either. So there's definitely impacts, but herring still do spawn in a lot of areas where there is development, including on docks and piers and other places. So I think there's a lot we don't know about the impacts of various types of pollution on herring themselves and on spawning and on survivability of spawn.
A lot more projects coming up through the coastal.
I think the Auk Bay situation is really instructive in a way. I mean, you think about the ferry terminal there and all the boat traffic coming in and out. It is so counter to Tlingit and Haida protocols relating to quieting of an area. I mean, it's just very, very busy 24/7. So it is certainly, I agree with you that pollution is one factor of it, but noise and boat activity is also very disruptive.
Yeah, there's a particular issue right there that I've always wanted to investigate, which is when that seafood processing plant went in on the Indian Point side of the ferry terminal, there was an agreement made to plant eelgrass in that inner cove area to offset those impacts, but that's never been evaluated, and I don't even know if the eelgrass even took there. So we do these things acting like, oh, we can offset one impact by creating better habitat for another, but they never get evaluated. So that's been my pet peeve on that particular Auk Bay area. Another good question is, what can we do as consumers of seafood to help with sustaining herring?
Oh, that's a great question. I have a quick answer, which is eat it, but don't eat it as a supplement, in a pill that's manufactured somewhere else. Just eat it as a fish or as herring eggs, because that's the best way to make use of herring is to value the fish itself. And there's a wonderful fisheries minister out of Peru, Patricia Majlev, who said the same thing. She said, but about anchovies. She said she had a title of a talk called something like "That Little Brown Fish on Your Pizza and an Ecosystem View of the World." Basically, you're better off eating down the food chain. So if you're eating herring directly, in a sustainable way, you're going to be healthier, and it's going to be healthier for herring. What you don't want to do is capture just the roe and grind everything else up, send it to China, have it processed as fish food, and then fed to fish farms, so that maybe even salmon farms, maybe even re-exported to some other country like Norway or Chile as as food for salmon farms, and then buy that farm salmon that's eaten your wild herring that was supposed to be eaten by your wild salmon, and the ludicrousness of the analogy just gets worse, or of the supply chain just gets worse. So her advice was eat these little oily fish. They're better actually for the health of the marine ecosystem than even eating the higher trophic level fish, because they've got,
Right. And sell them locally,
and sell them locally,
create local markets.
value add them. And we do see that in Southeast Alaska. I mean, if I was more of a food connoisseur, I would have done a chapter on pickling of herring and other other preservation techniques, because people have lots of ways of putting up herring and preserving it, or even eating it fresh, that are often not discussed in the literature, but make very nice food products. And spawn on kelp is another one, which is, herring do not die after they spawn like salmon. So when herring spawn on kelp, especially if they're not penned in a pen, it's an open pen, they can swim away and spawn again. And so you've got a renewable resource there with spawn on kelp, just like you do with spawn on branches. And that's also very nutritious. But there isn't a big market for it in the U.S., although it's traded.
I have another question on the commercial herring fishery. Do you know how long the commercial herring fishery lasted in the Juneau area?
Oh. It's probably in our timeline, Tom.
Yeah, I think it was going during the federal days. I mean, they had areas, and Juneau was the second highest commercial production area, at least in northern Southeast, second to Sitka. And then the crash came in 1982. I think that's the number I was trying to go for. And that was right after a large sacro fishery that was held just outside of Auk Bay, and that after that they have never come back to spawn in any great quantity. So that the history of what's happened in Auk Bay is really, I think, a lesson in how important it is to pay attention to wherever herring spawn in any numbers, and to really treat those areas with special care. And we obviously haven't done that, because if we had, we'd see more herring spawn in more places around Southeast Alaska. But the good news is that they do come back. And maybe if you use some traditional knowledge techniques like transplantation and clean up habitat, quiet areas and so on, and don't hammer them when they're about to spawn with a commercial fishery, we may see complete restoration of herring. They've certainly come back in areas where they've been allowed to, as it were. And that's true in the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Well, on that hopeful note, maybe we should move on. We have a lot of comments we could make on the kind of the newfound colonialism that you could describe. Use that term to describe what's happening in Sitka now, which is, I don't usually use that term, but it seems to be apropos to what's happening there with the legal and management system and all that. But in any case, I just want to thank you both for an outstanding presentation, and our viewers and the questions that were submitted. SHI invites everyone to return for our next lecture by Judith Dahutsu Ramos, entitled Traditional Tlingit Knowledge on Ice Flow Seal Hunting in Disenchantment Bay, Yakutat, Alaska, scheduled for next Tuesday, March 9th. We have a link below the YouTube video for a survey we hope you will take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and also allow our funders to measure the impact of the program. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org campus. Thank you very much and see you next week.